Hello everyone, and welcome to the 219th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our member and patron pick for February 2025, Odin from the God of War series. As you heard, the Odin episode was slated to be out in February, but I wanted to make sure I took my time with this character, so I delayed his release a tad to make sure this video was up to code, and I'm glad I did, because we have quite the episode ahead of us. Before we get into it though, I'd like to clarify a few things. Because the mythological Odin and the Odin we find in this game are so different, we won't be analyzing our world's Odin alongside this one. However, I did think it was appropriate to include information about our Odin so we might better understand the Odin we find in this story, and so at various points in this video, I will be referring to articles on Norse mythology that can be found on the website norse-mythology.org, which is an excellent source on Norse mythology, and if you'd like to check it out for yourself, there will be a link to it in the description, a link that I highly recommend you click, as it turns out that hyphen in norse-mythology.org is really important, because if you type it in without it, you get redirected to this website, thesoupclothing.com, which is a Turkish gambling website. So yeah, I think it's better that you click the link in the description. Aside from that though, be sure to check out my new gaming channel by clicking the link down in the description or the card on your screen. And of course, before we get started with this video, we do have a little business to take care of. So let's take a moment to learn about our sponsor for this video, HelloFresh. We all have days where starving sounds preferable to going grocery shopping, and when that happens, it's more often the case that we let our health take a backseat and head out to the nearest and greasiest fast food spot for a quick fix. But it doesn't have to be this way. With HelloFresh, you can get boxes of easy-to-make recipes with the freshest ingredients around delivered right to your doorstep, which will not just make your culinary life easier and keep you eating healthy when life gets too burdensome or busy, but varied and new, as HelloFresh has loads of options that will keep your taste buds looking forward to each new box of goodies they send you. Recipe boredom is one of the greatest roadblocks when it comes to health and wellness, but with 50+ dinner options, even more market items, and 30+ calorie-smart and protein-smart recipes, you'll never have a week, or even a month, where you're eating the same thing twice. HelloFresh is also incredibly flexible, as you can easily customize your deliveries week to week and mix and match lifestyle options to suit your needs, like fit and wholesome, quick and easy, vegetarian, and more. And I know that I've been looking forward to my meal kits more than I ever have before as HelloFresh continues to shake up their game and roll out exciting new options consistently. But don't just take it from me, check the link in the description or use my code and get 10 free meals plus free breakfast for life. One breakfast item per box while your subscription is active if you're in the US, and if you're outside the US, the local discount will apply. With a deal like that and ease at your fingertips, HelloFresh is a no-brainer. So click that link or scan my code to up your culinary game today. Thank you HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. Every story has its beginning and its end. For Odin in the world of Norse mythology, that beginning was defined by conflict, something that may very well be the most defining aspect of this pantheon and the Viking culture that was inspired by it. The origin of the cosmos. Before there was soil, or sky, or any green thing, there was only the gaping abyss of Ginnungagap. This chaos of perfect silence and darkness lay between the homeland of elemental fire, Muspelheim, and the homeland of elemental ice, Niflheim. Frost from Niflheim and billowing flames from Muspelheim crept towards each other until they met in Ginnungagap. Amid the hissing and sputtering, the fire melted the ice, and the drops formed themselves into Ymir, the first of the godlike but destructive giants. Ymir was a hermaphrodite and could reproduce asexually. When he slept, more giants leapt forth from his legs and from the sweat of his armpits. As the frost continued to melt, a cow, Atumla, emerged from it. She nourished Ymir with her milk, and she, in turn, was nourished by salt licks in the ice. Her licks slowly uncovered Buri, the first of the Aesir tribe of gods. Buri had a son named Bor, who married Besla, the daughter of the giant Bolthorn. The half-god, half-giant children of Bor and Besla were Odin, who became the chief of the Aesir gods, and his two brothers, Vili and Ve. Odin and his brothers slew Ymir and set about constructing the world from his corpse. They fashioned the oceans from his blood, the soil from his skin and muscles, vegetation from his hair, clouds from his brains, and the sky from his skull. 4 dwarves, corresponding to the 4 cardinal points, held Ymir's skull aloft above the earth. The gods eventually formed the first man and woman, Ask and Embla, from 2 tree trunks, and built a fence around their dwelling place, Midgard, to protect them from the giants. Now, more than establishing Odin's birth and the development of the 9 realms, what this information provides for us is the idea that Odin's life, and by extension all life in the 9 realms, was birthed from an act of violence, and it's that first violent act that has continued to define these realms ever since. Despite this, Odin in this story claims that his slaying of Ymir isn't quite as heinous as we might have thought it to be, as in a conversation with Loki regarding Ymir, Odin says that when he and his brothers took him down, they didn't exactly kill him, as he likens Ymir to a force of nature, a source of primordial power that technically couldn't be murdered, but rather used, and that when he did so, he was young and foolish, and thought that he could create something better, that he was looking out for the future of his people. If we look to our source on Norse mythology, this claim turns out to be more or less true. The centrality of conflict. The Vikings, like the other ancient Germanic peoples, were and are notorious for their eagerness for battle. It should come as little surprise, therefore, that conflict is such a central theme in their creation myth, and that conflict is itself a generative force. Ymir is born from the strife between fire and ice, and we can surmise that that particular opposition would have had a special poignancy for people living what was more or less a subsistence lifestyle in the cold lands of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. In order for the gods to fashion the world, they must first slay Ymir. This is the first intentional taking of a life in the universe, and it's performed by the gods themselves. It isn't presented as a crime or a sin, as in the biblical myth of Cain and Abel. Rather, it's a good and even sacred task. This isn't to say that the Norse valorize killing as such. Clearly, they distinguish between lawful and appropriate killing, and unlawful and inappropriate killing. But they embraced what they saw as the necessity of having a warlike approach to life for the sake of accomplishing great deeds that brought honor and renown to one's name. With this in mind, it would seem that Odin in this story was essentially telling the truth. But there are two things that we need to establish now before we go any further. One being that the Odin we find in God of War and the Odin of Norse mythology, though very similar, are not the same god. And two, that when it comes to anything God of War Odin says, more often than not, we have no way of knowing if he's telling the truth. With that in mind, there might be a shred of truth to his statement about Ymir, mainly the part about him being young and foolish, and the fact that Ymir was more so a force of nature than anything. But this Odin in all likelihood was not looking out for his people when he murdered Ymir, but looking to attain his first true love, power. And in murdering Ymir, he achieved a power greater than any of the mighty beings that surrounded him by several magnitudes. There are several such mythological origin stories throughout history, and while we could compare Odin's slaying of his progenitor to that of someone like Zeus, it would be more apt to compare him to Cronus, Zeus's father. Zeus overthrew Cronus after Cronus had murdered his own father and devoured his children out of fear of a prophecy that claimed one of his brood was destined to overthrow him. And in that way, Zeus's imprisonment of his father in Tartarus, or in this universe, sentencing him to carry Pandora's temple on his back, was an act of justified rebellion against a tyrant that sought to murder or subjugate him and his siblings. Cronus, on the other hand, overthrew his father Uranus because he was jealous of his power, so he castrated him and took his throne. So as much as Odin is comparable to Zeus in this universe as far as personality is concerned, Odin's rebellion against Ymir is nowhere near as noble as Zeus's was, and so this was likely his first act of evil that was born out of his selfish desire for his first love, power, and not something that should be excused. Regardless, after Odin murdered Ymir and claimed dominion over the 9 realms, there might have been some hope that he would rule as some sort of fair leader, despite his lust for power, though that notion is questionable at best. No, as treacherous as Odin's first crime was, it was nothing compared to what would come after. In the moment of his triumph, Odin had quite literally achieved everything, hegemony over an entire multiverse and all its people. And in that moment, standing on that hallowed ground, he must have felt magnificent. But then, something quite unexpected caught his eye. The reality tear, a force that would completely shatter whoever Odin might have been after he killed Ymir. When Odin spied this curious glowing rend in the fabric of reality, he naturally chose to peer into it to discover what it could possibly be. And while we don't know for certain what was beyond that tear, for Odin, what he saw was quite simple: madness. Odin claims that when he looked into the tear, he saw and heard things that he could not even begin to comprehend, but knew were true, proof of forces beyond this realm that none alive had knowledge of. Now Odin had just cemented his authority over the 9 realms, and he had everything, power unlimited, and a world with which he could do whatever he so desired. But now he had been given confirmation that things existed beyond his world that he could scarcely comprehend, and this sparked an epiphany within Odin regarding something he had probably never contemplated before this moment, and I imagine that he posed the following questions to himself. Where did Ymir and all that exists really come from? And, I am immortal, but I could be killed, and if there exists something beyond this realm, perhaps where all things come from and all things return to, what happens when I die? These are maddening questions for any sentient being. For humans, we have no real way of confirming what came before life and what happens beyond our deaths outside of faith and speculation. So we have to accept, at least at the time of this video's release, that we're only going to find out once we pass on and discover the truth for ourselves. Notions that have certainly driven some of us mad. And though we are constantly trying to answer these questions, on the whole, our helplessness when it comes to confirming these things grounds us in many ways and prevents the pursuit of these answers from driving us insane. For a god with unending life and immense cosmic and magical powers who has a possible answer to these questions right in front of his eyes though, the possibility of actually answering life's greatest questions became everything. Nothing mattered more to Odin after he looked into the tear than discovering its secrets, and from that moment on, nearly the very first moment that he obtained his kingdom, the pursuit of that goal dictated every word he spoke and every action that he took. Now it would be one thing if the pursuit of this knowledge drove Odin to shutting himself up in his study or ceaselessly traveling the world to find his answers, but who Odin is as a person ensured that any harmless approach to his goals would be an impossibility. In truth, it would seem that by his very nature, Odin was incapable of doing nothing less than committing himself absolutely to the pursuit of this forbidden knowledge, which is made evident by the section of the article on Odin from NorseMythology.org titled Wisdom, Magic, and Shamanism. One of the greatest differences between monotheistic theologies and polytheistic theologies is that, in the former, God is generally all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, etc. Polytheistic gods are none of these things. Like any human, tree, or hawk, they are limited by their particularity. For Odin, any kind of limitation is something to be overcome by any means necessary, and his actions are carried out within the context of a relentless and ruthless quest for more wisdom, more knowledge, and more power, usually of a magical sort. One of the most striking attributes of his appearance is his single, piercing eye. His other eye socket is empty. The eye it once held was sacrificed for wisdom. On another occasion, Odin sacrificed himself to himself by hanging on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, receiving no form of nourishment from his companions. At the end of this ordeal, he perceived the runes, the magically charged ancient Germanic alphabet that was held to contain many of the greatest secrets of existence. He is depicted as having subsequently boasted, "Then I was fertilized and grew wise. From a word to a word I was led to a word. From a work to a work I was led to a work." Odin's competitive side once drove him to challenge the wisest of the giants to a contest to see who was more knowledgeable and learned. The prize was the head of the loser, and Odin won by asking his opponent something that only he himself could know. Odin then claimed his prize and returned to Asgard. Along with Freya, he's one of the 2 greatest practitioners of shamanism amongst the gods. His shamanic spirit journeys are well documented. The Ynglinga saga records that he often travels to distant lands on his own errands or those of others, while he appears to others to be asleep or dead. Another instance is recorded in the Eddic poem, Baldur's Dreams, where Odin rode Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse typical of northern Eurasian shamanism, to the underworld to consult a dead Cirrus on behalf of his son. Odin, like shamans all over the world, is accompanied by many familiar spirits, most notably the ravens Hugin and Munin, the wolves Geri and Freki, and the Valkyries. The shaman must typically undergo a ritual death and rebirth in order to acquire his or her powers, and Odin underwent exactly such an ordeal when he discovered the runes. So clearly Odin has a natural drive to discover the various secrets of the world, and to consume all the knowledge he possibly can. And to do so, he's willing to go to such great lengths as temporarily taking his own life to explore the realm of death. Something that the Odin of God of War also does in his pursuit of the Tear's secrets, and tearing out his own eye to gain further wisdom, another thing that Odin does in the game. What made all of his efforts to delve into these secrets even worse though, was his discovery of the Ragnarok prophecy through the Jotungroa, which foretold his death in a cataclysmic battle in the future. And the knowledge that he had a prophesied death coming his way drove Odin to double his efforts so he might prevent his foretold demise by learning the secrets of the Rift and its mask. And his efforts to bolster the defenses of Asgard in preparation for this war also led to a great deal of suffering. So Odin has always desired power and control, and by keeping in mind his origin, his obsession with the tear and the mask, and his efforts to prevent his own prophetic demise, we have a good idea of what rules Odin's mind, and therefore a great starting point from which we can begin discussing his overall character. And now that we're here, let's take a further look at the article I quoted a moment ago to get a better idea of who Odin is in Norse mythology. Odin is one of the most complex and enigmatic characters in Norse mythology, and perhaps in all of world literature. He's the ruler of the Aesir tribe of deities, yet he often ventures far from their kingdom, Asgard, on long, solitary wanderings throughout the cosmos, on purely self-interested quests. He's a relentless seeker after and giver of wisdom, but he has little regard for communal values such as justice, fairness, or respect for law and convention. He's the divine patron of rulers, and also of outlaws. He's a war god, but also a poetry god, and he has prominent, effeminate qualities that would have brought unspeakable shame to any historical Viking warrior. He's worshipped by those in search of prestige, honor, and nobility, yet he's often cursed for being a fickle trickster. What kind of literary figure, let alone a god whose historical worship spanned much of a continent and several centuries, could possibly embody all of these qualities at once, with their apparently glaring contradictions? What's in a name? As mentioned above, Odin's name can be translated as Master of Ecstasy. His Old Norse name is formed from 2 parts, the noun author, ecstasy, fury, inspiration, and the suffix in, the masculine definite article, which, when added to the end of another word like this, means something like the master of, or a perfect example of. The 11th century historian Adam of Bremen confirms this when he translates Odin as the Furious. Author can take countless different forms. As one saga describes Odin, when he sat with his friends, he gladdened the spirits of all of them, but when he was at war, his demeanor was terrifyingly grim. This ecstasy that Odin embodies and imparts is the unifying factor behind the myriad areas of life with which he is especially associated: war, sovereignty, wisdom, magic, shamanism, poetry, and the dead. In modern popular culture, Odin is often portrayed as being an eminently honorable ruler and battlefield commander, not to mention impossibly muscular. But to the ancient Norse, he was nothing of the sort. In contrast to more straightforwardly noble war gods such as Tyr or Thor, Odin incites otherwise peaceful people to strife with what, to modern tastes, is a downright sinister glee. His attitude is not far from Nietzsche's dictum: "You say it is the good cause that hallows even war. I say unto you, it is the good war that hallows any cause." In keeping with his association with sovereignty, Odin doesn't generally concern himself with average warriors, preferring instead to lavish his blessings only on those whom he deems to be worthy of them. He maintains particularly close affiliations with the berserkers and other warrior shamans whose fighting techniques and associated spiritual practices center around achieving a state of ecstatic unification with certain ferocious totem animals, usually wolves or bears, and, by extension, with Odin himself, the master of such beasts. Thus, as a war god, Odin is principally concerned not with the reasons behind any given conflict, or even its outcome, but rather with the raw, chaotic battle frenzy that permeates any such struggle. Sovereignty. Odin's preference for the elite extends to all realms of society. As the chief of the Aesir gods, he's the defined archetype of a ruler. He's the legendary founder of numerous royal lines, and kings are as likely as shamanistic warriors to claim him as their beneficiary. The Germanic peoples, like other Indo-European peoples, originally had a three-tiered social/political hierarchy. The first tier consisted of rulers, the second of warriors, and the third of farmers and others occupied with production and fecundity. The gods and goddesses can be profitably mapped onto this schema, and Odin, along with Tyr, corresponds to the first tier. The crucial difference between Tyr and Odin in this regard, however, is that Tyr has much more to do with rule by law and justice, whereas Odin has much more to do with rule by magic and cunning. Tyr is the sober and virtuous ruler. Odin is the devious, inscrutable, and inspired ruler. Paradoxically, Odin is often the favorite god and helper of outlaws, those who had been banished from society for some especially heinous crime as well. Like Odin, many such men were exceptionally strong-willed warrior poets who were apathetic to established societal norms. The late 12th/early 13th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus even relates a tale of Odin being outlawed from Asgard for 10 years so that the other gods and goddesses wouldn't be tarnished by the vile reputation that he had acquired amongst many humans. Whatever their social stature, the men and women favored by Odin are distinguished by their intelligence, creativity, and competence in the proverbial war of all against all. Whether such people became kings or criminals is mostly a matter of luck. We've already, albeit briefly, discussed the berserkers and other distinguished warrior shamans under Odin's patronage. This was the form of Germanic shamanism that was the most socially acceptable for men to practice. The other main form of Germanic shamanism is contained within the magical tradition known as Seithur, of which Odin and Freya are the foremost divine practitioners. In traditional Germanic society, for a man to engage in Seithur was effectively to forsake the male gender role, which brought considerable scorn upon any male who chose to take up this path. As the sagas show, this didn't stop some men from practicing Seithur anyway. However, even Odin wasn't exempt from such charges of unmanliness and was taunted for adopting the feminine traits and tasks that form part of the backbone of Seithur. Saxo, in the passage on Odin's exile alluded to above, relates that, by his stage tricks and his assumption of a woman's work, he had brought the foulest scandal on the name of the gods. Note also the reference to being fertilized in the verse quoted above. While this is certainly a metaphor, it's a metaphor loaded with sexual implications that would have been immediately recognizable to any Viking Age or medieval reader or hearer of the poem. For our present purposes, it's sufficient to point out that, in the eyes of the pre-Christian Northern Europeans, Odin's practice of Seithur made him rather unmanly, being incapable of fulfilling the expectations that are placed upon an honorable man. But we've already noted Odin's scant concern for honor. He isn't one to refuse any ecstatic practice, even those that bring him ill repute. Poetry. Odin speaks only in poems, and the ability to compose poetry is a gift he grants at his pleasure. He stole the meat of poetry, the primeval source of the ability to speak and write beautifully and persuasively, from the giants. Ever since, he has dispensed it to certain gods, humans, and other beings whom he deems worthy of it. The Mede's Old Norse name is Othirir, the stewer of Othir, and as we have seen, Othir, ecstasy, fury, inspiration, is the root of Odin's name as well. This intoxicating drink, along with the power it grants, is yet another manifestation of his overflowing ecstasy. The Allfather. One of Odin's countless names is Allfather. According to Snorri Sturluson, he is the father of all the gods. And, as we've already noted, Odin is listed as the divine ancestor of countless families from all over Northern Europe. He's simultaneously an Aesir god, a Vanir god. The Vanir god Odur is only an extension or transposition of Odin, and a giant. His mother is Besla, one of the first frost giants. One Old Norse poem even identifies him with Ond, the breath of life. What can we discern in all of this regarding Odin's identity? In the same way that Thor is the divine force whose presence the Vikings felt in the thunder, Odin is the divine force whose presence the Vikings felt in Othir. To them, this inspiration/fury/ecstasy was not a profane phenomenon, but a sacred and even divine one that lay at the hearts of countless different undertakings, including many that were both especially rarefied and especially decisive in the Vikings' lives. This is perhaps why Odin is the chieftain of the gods. The realms of life over which he presided were to the other aspects of life what a ruler is to common people. The Norse saw their gods as the vital forces that held the cosmos together. As the Allfather, Odin was the vital force of vital forces, the breath of life, or something almost akin to Nietzsche's will to power. It's surely no accident that Odin played a greater role than any other god in the creation of the world. Without his vivifying ecstasy and the enchantment, insight, and clarity that it brings, life, and in particular a life worth living, would be impossible. While not everything in these excerpts matches up perfectly to God of War's rendition of Odin, there are quite a few similarities that we can draw between the two here that helps explain why Odin is who he is in this story. But the one thing this article neglected to touch on in great detail was Odin's appearance, which is fine considering what Odin looks like in this story is unlike any depiction we've seen of him in popular culture, and for good reason. Like everything about the Odin of God of War, his appearance has been carefully crafted to cultivate the image he wishes to project to his people and to better facilitate his efforts in completing his work. At a baseline, Odin's facial features are gentle and unimposing. He does not have the heavy brow and sinister gaze of someone like Kratos, the gargantuan bulk of Thor, nor the permanent sneer of a man like Heimdall. He simply appears as your average old man, who you might expect to offer you a bit of kind conversation if you passed him on the street. His voice is soft and measured, with a gentle amiability that's reassuring and disarming. And his eyes, or rather eye, is an enchanting shade of blue that serves to calm people as much as his soothing speech does. His balding head and medium-length beard also do much to soften his appearance, adding to that gentle grandfather look that he's cultivated so well. And though he wears the tattoos that are common amongst his people on his head, face, and forearms, they're more so pieces of art that are a customary part of his culture that don't take away at all from his kindly demeanor. As far as his clothes go, Odin dresses rather simply, wearing a blue tunic embroidered with gold, brown boots and pants, various baubles on his waist, an eye patch to hide his empty eye socket, and on occasion, a fur hat and a brown cloak embroidered with green and gold. Now, why his rather plain clothing, especially for a man who's the supreme god of his realm, is noteworthy, is because they are an exceptionally well-crafted accompaniment to his natural features that further solidifies the image he's created for himself. Like his appearance, his dress also does much to disarm. As though the embroidery and fine colors of his clothes signify for us his status as an important man, they aren't over-the-top extravagant and lavish, to the point where you'd immediately know that this man is a king, let alone the primary god of the realm he rules over. What this does is give Odin a sense of familiarity, the notion that this man, though incredibly powerful, is just another average person like any other Aesir, someone who is wise and harmless, but also humble and strong, which is only further emphasized by his modest dwelling, a wooden lodge instead of a decadent palace like one might expect.
Everyone's got me all wrong. You think war drives me, or power, wealth? Nah, never have. You know what drives me? What I really want? I want answers. Same as you.
While the choice to appear this way was certainly deliberate, as granting Odin that down-to-Asgard appearance has no doubt aided him greatly in dealing with both allies and enemies, even his appearance and lodgings tie back into the most important thing in Odin's life, his quest for knowledge and power. As when Atreus first arrives in Asgard, he asks Heimdall if the structure they're approaching is Odin's palace, to which Heimdall replies that Odin does not need to puff himself up like some mortal chieftain, for real power does not need to flaunt. While I'm sure Odin feels that way, I'd wager that he more so doesn't fuss over his dress and abode, because Odin doesn't really care about anything other than his own ambitions. And while he likely chose to dress himself the way he does to better serve those ambitions as we've already discussed, his lodge is a testament to this notion, as what more does Odin need than a place to store his things, lay his head, and study his work? But now that we've established Odin's appearance and how it affects our perception of him, as well as his actions, let's start talking about his personality and overall traits. First and foremost, Odin is incredibly intelligent and cunning, or as Mimir puts it, almost as clever as he thinks he is. And with his intelligence comes great skills in manipulation, coercion, subterfuge, and warfare. Unfortunately, that intelligence is tempered by a gargantuan ego, cruelty, a touch of sadism, a sick sense of humor, and a near-complete lack of empathy or mercy, as Odin is a man who, as the Lord of the Nine Realms, feels himself to be above all beings, and a god who by right has the power to decide what's best for himself and everyone living. As Odin created the Nine Realms, and ordered them in the way they are at the time the story begins, via his slaying of Ymir, and so as the creator of the current status quo, Odin believes his word and his vision to be the truth. Mimir put it best when Atreus remarked how Odin's recounting of stories Mimir had told him varied drastically.
Mimir, I'm not sure how to ask this. There's stories Odin told me, like how he lost his eye, where the details are different from stories you've told me. And I trust you, of course, but they don't seem like things he'd have a reason to lie about either.
One thing to remember about liars, lad. They lie. They do it on principle. No issue too big or too small. They lie about anything they can get away with and some things that they can't, just to demonstrate their power over reality. You must always bear that in mind.
So even when Odin lies, he's telling the truth as far as he's concerned, because the world exists as Odin sees it, and that's that. There is no room for interpretation. There is only the vision of a man who calls himself Allfather, Lord of all, and leash holder of 9 realms, who makes reality whatever he wishes it to be. If it wasn't clear enough already, some of Odin's most defining characteristics are selfishness and covetousness, as not only does Odin operate as if he has all the answers, but he operates for the sole benefit of himself, and he is not a man who would deign to share even a fraction of his power or the vast amount of knowledge that he's gathered over the years. Odin has likely helped many people over the course of his long existence in many different ways, but more often than not, the help he offers others is only incidental, or it's offered so he might further whatever goals he has in mind at the time, leaving his care for those he's responsible for virtually non-existent. Now, while Odin desires power and control, and has quite a lot of it, he's also a man who greatly fears losing his power, and so naturally Odin is a very fearful and paranoid man. However, because he is an intelligent man, that paranoia and fear are often dealt with through careful planning and strategies that aim to eliminate the doubts plaguing his mind. And when those options are no longer feasible, he's not above taking drastic and brutal measures to ensure that his iron grip on everything in creation remains firmly in hand. Despite this, Odin is not immune from succumbing to his fear, as when he isn't pressed, he thinks calmly and rationally, but when he is, he's not above acting impulsively in the moment to protect himself or his interests. Despite his often pragmatic approach to his relations and endeavors, Odin is not above lashing out in anger, especially when he's drunk, and he can also be quite vindictive, holding grudges long after he's been offended by someone. Now, if you couldn't tell, there really aren't many or any virtues in Odin's character. Well, there potentially are some, but they've been so buried by everything he's become that they aren't worth factoring into his true persona. Though we will be discussing what could have been with Odin and the small tinges of humanity or Aesirness that he does have in a while. But out of every trait of Odin's we've discussed so far, there is none more important than what really defines who Odin is: utter insanity. Now, I don't mean insanity in the sense that Odin is suffering from some sort of mental illness. Far from it. In fact, Odin is incredibly lucid. What I mean by insanity is that Odin is so consumed by discovering what happens when he dies, preventing his own death, and holding on to his power, that he lives a life thoroughly dedicated to all three at the expense of everything and everyone else in it, which is simply put, madness. Nearly everything in existence has been negatively affected in some way by Odin's obsessions, and as we've already discussed, those obsessions rule every action that he's ever taken, as well as the lives of everyone around him. And so the best way we're going to get a good handle on Odin's madness, as well as who he is as a person, is by examining his actions. But because those actions are intimately tied to the relationships he has with his fellow Aesir, as well as many other peoples of the 9 realms, I believe it's best that we take a look at how those relationships have defined Odin's story before we begin talking about his crimes. As we've already established by looking through his backstory, Odin doesn't exactly hold family in high regard, as in order to obtain the position he currently occupies, he murdered his great-grandfather, and that willingness, conscious or otherwise, to ignore the bonds that he has with his family, have severely harmed his relationships with every single one of them since. By all accounts, there are only 4 beings that Odin has ever felt any true tenderness for: his ravens Hugin and Munin, his first wife Fjorgyn, and to a lesser extent, his second wife Freyja. Now, the reason Hugin and Munin were so loved by Odin is because they weren't really creatures that formed some sort of natural bond with Odin, but birds that he magically engineered to be extensions of his will. At some point in the past, Odin came across a flock of ravens, and he ended up cooking and eating all but 2 of them, Hugin and Munin. whose memories he wiped and endowed them with great intelligence and powers that would assist Odin in his endeavors, binding them so closely to him that when they weren't out doing his bidding, they lived as tattoos on his forearms. That isn't to say that they didn't have a mind of their own, but as they were essentially extensions of Odin himself, it's no wonder that Odin was so fond of them, to the point that when they're eliminated by Freya and Atreus during their final confrontation with Odin, he actually cries out when they're destroyed, a display of emotion for his fallen pets that he didn't even bother to express when witnessing, learning of, or causing the deaths of his many family members. Though we don't know much about their relationship, according to Mimir, Odin seemed to genuinely love Fjorgyn, with her death causing him great pain to such an extent that he was reportedly never the same again after her demise. It's speculated that Fjorgyn, though her death is described as being mysterious, actually died giving birth to her son Thor, as a lore marker for the rites of Fjorgyn states the following. Here we bear witness to the funeral rites of Fjorgyn of the Jotnar, goddess of the earth and trees. For her beauty she was seduced, for her love she was betrayed, and for her gift of life, her life was claimed. To the summit and across the bridge she shall be borne, where nevermore the thunder may find her. Fjorgyn's death could have been an amplifier for Odin's obsessions, as like anyone who develops obsessions like Odin, it's reasonable to assume that early on, he wasn't as consumed by them as he was by the time we meet him in this story, and seeing his first love perish before his eyes could have easily pushed him even more towards unlocking the rift's secrets than he already had been. Losing a loved one is never easy for any of us, but losing a loved one as a god who could potentially make it so that loved one never died if he could only obtain more power would undoubtedly only have compounded the madness he's already suffering through. However, when it comes to his relationship with Freya, things were a bit different. It would seem that at some point Odin truly cared for Freya, as he did make efforts to reassure his reluctant bride that he would protect her, and that he would be the only family she would ever need, and he even stated during his final confrontation with her that he really did love her. That may have been true to a point, though Odin had descended much further into madness by the time he married Freya, rendering him incapable of truly loving her in the way he may have loved Fjorgyn due to his obsession. Regardless, their marriage was still one of opportunity, and not one made purely out of love, as the union between Odin and Freya was orchestrated by Mimir to end the Aesir-Vanir War, so Odin's love for Freya was likely tempered by its foundation. Whatever the truth of Odin's feelings for her were, he still slighted her in a grievous way as he tends to do with all those who are close to him, cursing Freya by trapping her in Midgard and removing her fighting spirit, causing her to be incapable of defending herself, while also taking away her desire to fight at all after she dared to stand up to Odin's genocide of the Jotnar. As despicable as his treatment of Freya was though, as far as Odin's treatment of his friends and loved ones go, nothing compares to his treatment of Mimir and his children. In this story, Mimir isn't technically a god. He does essentially become one, but he was originally a fae in service to the fairy king Oberon as an errand boy and jester from an area in or around what we now know as Scotland. Mimir was apparently quite mischievous in his youth, and after tiring of his antics, Oberon banished him from his kingdom, and during his ensuing travels, Mimir eventually made his way to the Nine Realms, settling first in Midgard before meeting with Odin himself. When Mimir met with Odin, he cleverly offered Odin what he craved most in the world, knowledge through his Mimisbrunner, an object that he claimed was filled with a liquid that contained a wealth of untold knowledge, but one that was in reality just a vessel that contained a potion that was mixed with a hefty dose of magic mushrooms. Though Odin knew of Mimir's trickery, he chose to drink from this well all the same, and after suffering through a legendary trip that caused him to tear out his eye, he decided to make Mimir his chief advisor. Despite his service to the Allfather though, Mimir quickly began to realize that Odin was not a god that should be enabled, and so as time went on, he slowly but surely began to undermine Odin's diabolical plans in any way that he could. Something that Odin unfortunately eventually caught on to. Accusing Mimir of aiding the giants during the Aesir's campaign against them, Odin saw fit to tie Mimir to a tree atop Midgard's highest peak, and after initially tearing out his left eye as compensation for the eye he lost to Mimir's machinations long ago, he proceeded to keep him there so he might return each day to torture him physically and mentally, like the eagle returning each day to tear out Prometheus's liver. For 109 winters, Mimir was tied to that tree, and so for nearly 40,000 days, Mimir was tortured by Odin, and aside from highlighting just how brutally cruel and sadistic Odin can be, this also emphasizes for us just how vindictive Odin is, as not only did he torture him for 109 years, but he never forgot about Mimir's trickery upon their initial meeting, and had likely always planned to get back at him at some point, showing us that Odin is not a man who can bear a slight against him, is one who holds an intense grudge, and is one who will do whatever he feels is necessary to punish a person for daring to attempt to harm, influence him in any way, or deny him what he wants. Now as far as his children go, there's a few things to note here. Odin had 10 sons, 6 of which, those being Meli, Bragi, Hodr, Vidar, Vali, and Hermod, either being mentioned only briefly in this story or not appearing at all. So we don't really know what his relationship with any of them was like in this universe. But the 4 sons who are featured in this story, those being Thor, Tyr, Heimdall, and Baldur, have all been severely affected by their father's treatment of them. Thor, firstborn of all Odin's sons, arguably got it the worst. Born from his union with Fjorgyn, Thor is a half-giant, half-Aesir who was bred to fulfill one purpose, and one purpose only, to be the hammer with which his father crushes his enemies, and that's exactly how Odin treats him. From a young age, Thor was taught to be strong, brutal, and merciless, a man who his father could count on whenever he needed somebody's head caved in, and outside of his conditioning, Odin has seemingly never had a real relationship with his son. He tells him what to think and what to do, yes, but other than that, there is no love between father and son, which makes sense when you consider that Odin has little love to give to anyone other than himself. Odin didn't just teach his son to be vicious though, he taught him that being vicious is the only thing he's good for, instilling a sense of worthlessness in Thor that makes him simultaneously bound to his father so he might have a purpose, and bitter and angry at the fact that he must be the man he's been made to be. And though all Aesir seem to hold a love for alcohol within them, this has caused Thor to be drunk more often than he's sober, in an attempt to dull the dreaded feelings he carries within him on a daily basis. On top of all this, Odin made sure to beat into his son an intense hatred for his own people, the Giants, which turned Thor into perhaps the one Aesir that despised the Giants the most, and thus himself, something that aided him greatly when he was sent by his father to murder the entire giant race. Something Thor says to Kratos sums up just how much Odin's brainwashing has affected him. "Do you know what I've done? We don't change. We are destroyers." Despite this mindset, Thor did try to change a few times, but what's even more sad about Thor's story is that those few times he did try and make himself into something better, his father managed to tear him right back down where he wants him to be. When Thor vows to stop drinking after Magni and Modi's deaths, and we see him interacting with his father in a rather sullen manner, the only thing that Odin has to offer his son besides slights and jabs is perhaps the worst thing you can say to a recovering addict. "I liked you better when you were drunk." Finally, when Thor really does attempt to change in a drastic way by ignoring his father's orders after his final battle with Kratos, Odin pointedly tells him this.
Why isn't he dead? Are you talking? Who told you to do that? You don't talk. You don't think. I think. You kill. It's a simple fucking concept.
And after saying so, and Thor still refuses to follow his orders, Odin chooses to murder his son, afterwards stating to his granddaughter who just witnessed her father's death that it wasn't his fault, and it was their enemies who did this to them. A dire example of Odin's lies taking precedence over truth, even when the truth is staring right back at a person, as their ears are filled with Odin's poison. Tyr, though seemingly given a vast degree of autonomy when compared with Thor, also suffered quite a bit at the hands of his father. Ever just and fair, Tyr played a big part in bringing the realms together, which was reflected in his temple in Midgard, a waypoint between the 9 realms that could allow anyone to travel between them in a matter of moments. Unfortunately though, unity was not something Odin wished to promote, and after a disastrous meeting between himself and Tyr and the Giants during his war against them where Odin feigned a truce while trying to learn more of the Giants' secrets, Tyr and Odin's relationship was essentially shattered, as not long after this event, Odin, who was steadily growing more fearful that Tyr may usurp him at some point, accused Tyr of aiding the Giants, afterwards sending an army to destroy his temple and undo all the great work his son had done for the various peoples of the 9 realms. Fortunately and unfortunately for Tyr, Odin still found his wayward son to be useful, as he planned to pose as Tyr at a later date in order to mine unassuming beings for their valuable information, and so instead of murdering him like Thor, he imprisoned him in Niflheim. For Odin, as powerful as he was, could only transform into someone else if they were still living, and so Tyr, though escaping death, was sentenced to languish in a cell as his father tore apart the realms he had worked so hard to keep together. Baldur, while suffering a similar fate to Thor, had it marginally better than his 2 elder brothers. Baldur, who had a spell placed over him by his mother that rendered him incapable of being harmed, but also incapable of feeling, was essentially a madman. The lack of feeling sundered his mind so severely that his singular purpose in life became exacting his revenge against his mother for cursing him in this way, which made him ripe for molding into a tool for Odin to use to further his cause, as unlike Thor, who required a heavy amount of conditioning to make him into the killing machine he was, Baldur only needed a small push in the direction Odin wanted him to go in, as so long as the Allfather promised Baldur that he would one day get his revenge against his mother, he was willing to do whatever it took to obtain it. Though Odin wasn't directly responsible for making Baldur into who he was responsible for enabling his dark desire to exact his revenge upon Freya, and because he kept pushing his son to chase after vengeance, he did play a part in Baldur's death, as if his dear father had tried to alleviate his son's woes instead of exasperating them, perhaps Baldur would not have had to meet his end at the hands of Kratos and Atreus. Now Heimdall, out of all of Odin's children, was given rather preferential treatment. Not because Odin necessarily had a soft spot for him, but because Heimdall's ability to read people's minds was an invaluable asset that could greatly aid Odin in his endeavors, and possibly undo him if he didn't handle him correctly. So Heimdall was given a position of comfort, guardian of Asgard and wielder of Galahorn, and as the favorite of the high god of this universe, Heimdall developed into a snide, condescending, and holier-than-thou sycophant who worshipped his father and gleefully enacted any of his designs, whether dark or otherwise. So Heimdall was essentially made to be the perfect Odin loyalist, forcing out whatever personality he may have developed in favor of being Odin's primary lapdog. And while the treatment he received from his father wasn't nearly as horrific as the treatment his brothers received, Heimdall's character is the ideal representative of our next topic of discussion, Aesir culture, or rather, the cult of Odin. Asgard is a place of peace and beauty, a land that's lush and verdant where the Aesir live in relative harmony under the protection of the Allfather. However, the only reason it's as nice as it is because Odin knows how to keep his followers content, so they might be ready and willing to do whatever he wishes. Like any cult leader, Odin has instilled within the Aesir that there is something bigger than themselves that they must give their all to, the Allfather, giver of life and protector of the realms, whose call must be answered no matter what. Odin seems to have a friendly relationship with his people. As the few times we see him interacting with Aesir that aren't his family members, he seems to treat them well, and they in turn show him the respect afforded a man who leads and protects his people. However, his people fear him as much as they love him. As though Odin does well to hide his madness, his mask has slipped enough times to the point that the Aesir seem to be quite wary of him. However, he has so bludgeoned them with propaganda stating that his and their position as overlords of the Nine Realms are divine and absolute, and that position must be protected at any cost, that his people feel they have no choice but to accept the will of a man who is more powerful than all of them combined. And because by nature the Aesir are quite warlike, they're more than willing to carry out whatever orders their dear leader gives them, a sinister conditioning that has made it so the sole purpose of every Aesir's life is to live and die for the Allfather, which is exactly what many of them do come Ragnarok. Now, one set of people we haven't discussed yet are the rest of Odin's immediate family, such as his daughter-in-law and his grandchildren. But unlike his sons, Odin's treatment of them can be discussed as a group, as they are all seen by Odin in much the same way he sees his sons, as tools that he doesn't necessarily need to mold like he did his sons, because his establishment of his cult has seen them worshipping him from birth, or in the case of Sif, acquiescing to his wishes due to her position as his son's wife. And as much as people like Magni, Modi, and Thrud are used to advance his position, they're more so an afterthought that I imagine Odin never really thinks twice about after he's given them orders. And in that way, they should pretty much be considered as being the same as any other Aesir, foot soldiers with whom Odin can do with as he sees fit, but not much else. Another sad aspect of the family structure Odin has created for himself, as well as his people. Now, as much as the state of the Aesir people under Odin is horrific, there's so much more Odin has done to the other peoples of the Nine Realms that his treatment of his own seems downright cushy in comparison. And we have various lore markers as well as Mimir to thank for granting us insight into some of the more personal crimes he's committed against the people he's supposedly charged with protecting. Take the story of Hrungnir the Giant.
Ed, you are full of stories. When will you tell one that entertains?
I beg your pardon?
He just insulted you.
Yeah, I got that. So you want a corker, do you? Very well, my brothers. I'll tell you the story of Hrungnir, the brawler. The real story.
There was a huge battle, right? His shrine had him in the middle, fighting off Aesir.
A pretty story, but no. Hrungnir, you see, was born with neither head nor heart. So the giants had to complete him with stone. He was strong, to be sure, but also a perfect simpleton. Odin met him wandering in Midgard one day. Found him so amusing, so harmless, so gullible, that he invites him back to his palace in Asgard. There he gives Hrungnir his fill of mead, and goads him into all manner of boasts and antics, all for the amusement of the court. I was there. I saw the Aesir laugh as Hrungnir leapt upon his shield and swore he'd kill us all and take our womenfolk back to Jotunheim. Then Thor shows up. And does he laugh? Oh, no. Thor takes one look at the drunken stone buffoon and brings down Mjolnir on his head so hard that he's got chunks of Hrungnir in his own skull to this day. Thor is so startled by the face full of rock, he doesn't notice Hrungnir's body topple right onto him with a sickening crunch. And again, the roars of laughter echo through the palace halls.
That's an awful story, Mimir. Nothing like the ones Mother told me.
Let that be a lesson, my son. Truth is seldom so pretty as myth and legend.
As you can see, Odin's cruelty reaches far. As though he's often humorless in a single-minded pursuit to obtain more knowledge, power, and control, he does take some time out of his day to enjoy a bit of levity and provide some for his people, especially if it's at someone else's expense. Next up is the tale of Skathi, the Queen of the Hunt.
Ymir, what can you tell me about that giant lady with the bow?
She was called Skathi, Queen of the Hunt. Her father was Thiotzi, who could take the shape of any wild creature, and taught Skathi how to hunt them all. From the ribs of pack beasts, she fashioned second feet, allowing her to glide upon the snow so no animal could evade her. She became a huntress beyond compare, even to any god. Odin himself wanted her for his bride, believing she would bear him strong sons. But she spurned his affections, and for that insult, Odin vowed revenge. It was put forth that the Aesir were plagued by an eagle who would steal the precious golden apples of Idun. Not even the finest archer among the gods could bring it down. Odin knew that Skathi could not resist the temptation to prove herself superior, and so she joined the hunt. Skathi tracked the eagle as it flew where she alone could glide, and loosed an arrow from her unerring bow. When she collected her quarry, she found no eagle at all, but her own father, poor Thiotzi, slain by his own daughter. She was overcome with grief and shame, for there is nothing nature so reviles as a child who kills their parent. Skathi succumbed to her fate as winter's blanket fell, holding her father as the mountain held her in an embrace to last eternity.
Well, that was sad.
Aye. There aren't many happy endings for the giants, I'm afraid.
As we discussed earlier, Odin is not a man who can bear a slight in any form, and so it sadly makes sense that he would orchestrate such a cruel fate for a woman who spurned his affections. A fate that's a testament to just how barbaric and heart-wrenching Odin's treatment of others can be. Skoll and Hati, the wolfen bringers of day and night, were also impacted by Odin's designs.
You're familiar with the tale of Skoll and Hati, bringers of day and night?
Oh yeah, the wolf giants.
Aye. They were born of the archwolf Hrothwitnir, a great nemesis of the Aesir gods. Odin captured them as pups and kept them in the kennels of Asgard to hold his foe at bay. But when the sun and moon grew mutinous and stood still, Odin put Skoll and Hati to use. With his ancient magics, he cast the wolves to the heavens, and they began their chase. And long shall they chase, but not endlessly. For it is foretold that someday Skoll and Hati will catch and devour their prey. And that day shall be Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods.
But Ragnarok is supposed to be Odin's doom, isn't it? Why would he set the wolves loose if it fulfills the prophecy?
Precisely the question, lad. It's always about control. The wolves determine when Ragnarok begins, and now he controls the wolves. A battle fought on his timetable is a battle he better stands to win.
Not quite as brutal as the previous two examples, but still a noteworthy instance of Odin placing all he can under his command in order to subvert his fate. Groa's fate, however, the giantess who foretold the prophecy of Ragnarok, was definitely brutal.
Mimir, there was a shrine about a giant lady with lots of books and visions.
Ah, that would be Groa, the Knowledge Keeper. She was a gifted sorceress who gathered every tome of arcane wisdom she could find in the realms, all in the hopes of augmenting her powers of prophecy that she might find her lost husband, Aurvandil. But it was not her husband she would glimpse in her visions, for it was Groa, seeing longer and farther than any before or since, who witnessed Ragnarok, the end and the beginning. When Odin caught word of her ultimate prophecy, he maneuvered to obtain her knowledge and hoard it for himself. Groa knew Odin as a long-time patron of her services, and so she welcomed him into her library as a friend. What she did not know is that Odin himself was behind her husband's disappearance, having used his enchantments to conceal his death at Thor's hands from her sight. Smiling, jealous Odin took her by the throat and with his very hands he stole her library and her life for his own.
I always knew Odin was bad, but that's just...
Ruthless, barbaric, heartless? That's Odin. In fact, we would do well to sit here in silence for the next few moments and reflect on Odin's capacity for cruelty.
Not much to
But
say
have
about
you
that one. I
seen
think Mimir had it nailed down
something
perfectly.
noteworthy?
The story of Starkor the Mighty is another tragically brutal tale of Odin's depravity.
No.
Okay. What about the giant with 8 arms?
Starkath the Mighty, he was called. If the Giants ever had anything so organized as an army, Starkath would have been their general. An opinion, in retrospect, I should have kept to myself. But no, as Odin's advisor, I kept him advised. And having bent his will towards Starkath's doom, there was no dissuading him. But even Thor wasn't stupid enough to take on Starkath on his own. No. Instead, the Aesir set forth slanders upon Starkath's name, branding him throughout the realms as a monster to be feared. They said he abducted an elf queen who killed herself rather than be ravished by the giant. Lies, of course, but you're too young for her story. In the end, even the Vanir gods and the armies of Midgard were roused to the cause. They surrounded Starkath, showered him with arrows until he was brought to his knees. He surrendered, hoping by trial he could clear his name. Thor took advantage and ripped off one of Starkath's arms, which only made it easier to sever another and another until he was satisfied. Relieved of 6 arms and too much blood, Starkath perished upon the battlefield. I regret it to this day, you know. I told myself there was nothing I could do, but I wish I'd tried.
Just a small suggestion of danger to Odin, and a life can be ended in the most brutal of fashions. And such was the case for Starkor, whose felling is as legendary as it is tragic. And much the same can be said for the story of Thamur the Stonemason, his son Hrimthur, Thrym, and Ivaldi respectively.
This chisel we seek, what is it?
I'm glad you asked, actually. I have just the story for you. There was a giant once named Thamur. A very giant, who, despite his mountainous size, was without question the greatest stonemason this world had ever seen. Proud Thamur hoped to one day pass his vast knowledge on to his son. But young Hrimthur had the heart of a warrior. Perhaps the father had too much fear in him, the son too little. Either way, a quarrel of theirs spiraled out of control, and the overworked stonemason, bonk, struck his son. Hrimthur ran off into the night. Feeling shame and regret, Thamur chased after his son. But in his emotional state, soon found himself wandering Midgard, lost and alone. Sadly, he caught the eye of the one person he didn't want to meet alone that night, so far from home. Thor.
And what happened next?
You'll see.
Thor killed him. Oh no. He fell in a village?
Aye. When Thamur fell, he crushed a charming place famed for worshipping the Vanir god Njord. Thor always took credit for planning that one. The truth is, the sweaty clawbag just got lucky.
Mimir, you never told me what happened with the stonemason's son.
Hrimthur, son of Thamur. After completing his father's masterwork, the Great Wall of Jotunheim, he thought of nothing but making the Aesir pay for their crimes against the giants. Once he longed to fight Thor, but tragedy had brought wisdom to Hrimthur, and cunning. He observed that Asgard's walls were half-built and shoddy, for no Aesir god could be bothered with such tiresome labour. So Hrimthur adopted the guise of an ordinary man and made the Aesir an offer. He would build them majestic new walls, and if he couldn't build them within 2 turns of the season, they would owe him nothing for his labours. And if he succeeded, he asked only for an audience with the goddess Freya. Odin agreed, knowing the task was impossible, but intrigued by this stranger. Hrimthur made short work of it, of course. He had the benefit of his father's training and the aid of a magical stallion for fetching stones. Odin was not happy to find himself on the losing end of the wager, but he seemed to uphold his end of the bargain. Freya was sent to meet the Mason, and to her surprise, he wanted only to whisper something in her ear. That being done, he made his way out of Asgard, and when he found Thor awaiting him at the gates of Midgard, he knew he had been double-crossed. But he didn't care, because his plan was complete.
It was? What did he say to Freya?
Only she could say for certain, but I've had many moons to work it out. Hrimthur knew that Freya loathed the Aesir, despite her marriage to Odin, and I believe he gave her the secret to Asgard's defences. Some weakness he may have built in, structural or magical, which I expect will be exploited come Ragnarok when Surtur arrives to burn Asgard to ash, if not sooner. Freya, there's something I've always wanted to ask. What was it Hrimthur whispered to you?
Who?
Hrimthur, the son of Thormur, the stonemason, who disguised himself and built Asgard's wall.
Oh, yes. One of the many occasions Odin saw fit to involve me in a wager without my consent. I wish I could say that was the worst of his husbandly habits.
What wager?
I've told this story, brother.
And now she may tell her own.
There isn't that much to tell. I knew nothing of it at first, surely because Odin didn't expect to lose the bet. A mysterious mason had to build the entire wall in 3 turns of the season.
2! It was 2!
And if he was late, he'd be owed nothing. But if he succeeded, he was promised an audience with the queen. Or so I learned one day when Odin burst into our bedchambers, raging and half-drunk before noon, telling me to get dressed and go see what the mason wants. So, off I went, not knowing what had truly been promised or expected, dagger stashed in my robe for emergency. And this mason, this giant in disguise...
His name was Hrimthur!
He just smiled to see me, and as you said, he whispered in my ear. He said the Aesir had killed his father, and he needed to know that one day they'd burn for it. I pointed out I was Aesir now too, technically. He gave me a look, as if he somehow knew better, and continued. He said he'd built in a structural flaw behind the Asgard Realm Tower.
I knew it! How do we make use of it?
We don't. He said Surtur would know what to do. And if Surtur's approaching Asgard's wall...
Then it is already Ragnarok.
Aye, blast it. I hoped it might have given us another way.
Mimir, why don't you tell us the story of the giant that stole Thor's hammer?
Happily, my boy. It involves your friend Freya, too, though I don't expect it's one she'd enjoy being reminded of. The giant was called Thrym, and he proved cunning enough to make off with Mjolnir while the Thunder Lummox slept. Sadly for Thrym, he didn't always think with his brain. Though he had robbed the greatest giant killer of his greatest weapon, he offered to trade it back to the Aesir in exchange for Freya as his bride. Now, at this point, Freya was married to Odin, and Odin, frankly, would have traded her for a sufficiently strong mead, but he saw an opportunity here. Thrym's palace was in Jotunheim, and only giants know the way. By agreeing to the marriage, they'd have to escort Freya back to their realm. So, Odin coerced Freya into using her Seithar magics to conceal Thor, so he could sneak along with her and infiltrate Jotunheim. When the hammer was produced as the wedding dowry, Thor revealed himself. He took back Mjolnir and wasted no time in smashing Thrym's skull, followed by every other giant present for the festivities. The only thing that put a stop to it was Freya, who wanted no part of this massacre. She cast a powerful spell that hurtled them both out of Jotunheim with no means of return. Odin was livid, hoping that Thor's foothold in Jotunheim would become his own. And oh, would he ever revenge himself upon Freya?
What is the point of this story, Head?
Well, for Thrym, the lesson would be to keep his priorities straight. For Freya, it's that doing good has a price. For Thor, it's that no object of power makes you what you are. And if what you are is the biggest butchering bastard in the 9 realms, nobody can take that away from you.
What this place?
You are standing at the entrance to Ivaldi's workshop, a testament to the ingenuity of dwarven engineering.
Why does it smell so bad?
It's quite foul, isn't it? Well, that's a long story, but, quite simply, Ivaldi messed with forces he shouldn't have, and you're breathing the consequences.
So, Ivaldi created this mist?
No, Niflheim has always been a land of mist. And snow. Endless snow. And wind and ice. Really, it's never been a pleasant location. But Ivaldi found a way to harness all that frosty power, and built marvels that shocked the realms of both man and god.
Wow.
Yes. Wow.
So then what happened? After Ivaldi built all the marvels?
Ah, yes, well, Odin wasn't keen on the idea of dwarves building contraptions that challenged his power, so he intervened. Ivaldi was furious and retaliated. From there, things escalated, and well, here we are. Cursed mist.
And this is why gods are best avoided.
Now these are some of the more personal and intimate ways in which Odin is sowed evil in this world. But he's unleashed much more evil through relentlessly pursuing his quest to discover the secrets of the rift. Evil that can be felt across all 9 realms in various ways. As with his loyal cultists faithfully enacting his designs, Odin has managed to mar many of the 9 realms just as well as he's protected Asgard. And so it is that much of the pain Odin has inflicted upon the various peoples of this world can be gleaned by examining the state of some of the realms at the time Kratos and Atreus' story in this world begins. Those realms being Svartalfheim, Vanaheim, Midgard, and Jotunheim. If we start with Svartalfheim, we find that this realm has been essentially made into a vassal state as a result of Odin and Mimir's manipulation, and it's the only realm and peoples that were truly allied with Odin. Seeing that he would require the dwarves' ingenuity in order to provide his forces with deadly war machines and the like once Ragnarok began, Odin took care to extend a friendly hand to the dwarves at every turn, providing them with copious resources and advantages he didn't afford the other realms that slowly but surely ensured the dwarves would begin to venerate Odin, to the point that they created many statues of him and even initially refused to break their alliance with him once Ragnarok began. However, Odin's earning of the dwarves' trust was not solely built on good relations and gifts, but subtle manipulations that forced the dwarves to rely on him and the Aesir. Mimir was responsible for enacting much of the subterfuge Odin ordered, like by ensuring the forges the dwarves used to create all the machinery Odin ordered would poison their soil, and thus force them to rely on trade with Asgard for food, and also by, and I quote from the Codex entry on Draki, ordering Mimir to disrupt Svartalfheim's natural ecosystem in an effort to push the dwarves towards industrialization. I knew these apex predators, a variant of dragons native to Vanaheim, would wreak havoc on the dwarvish ecosystem. What I did not know is just how effective they would be, the complete extinction of several native species, and an imbalance that will take lifetimes to undo. By keeping the dwarves in bondage through their sabotage, while simultaneously instilling within them a deep respect for Odin, the dwarves became nearly as brainwashed as the Aesir were. And while they did enjoy certain privileges as a result, their people suffered greatly as the policies enacted by Mimir ravaged their world and thinned their numbers. A dread example of just how willing Odin is to reshape entire worlds, so he might obtain the knowledge he so deeply desires. Vanaheim, while not being touched by Odin so much directly, has seen much destruction and carnage wrought on its land and peoples by the Aesir-Vanir War, a war that was born from the simple fact that the Vanir are peaceful and loving by nature, while the Aesir are warlike and brutal, a conflict which Odin can be blamed for as its chief architect. Similar to Vanaheim, Jotunheim didn't necessarily suffer much itself, as the way to it has always been hidden to Odin. But Odin's influence over it can be felt in the fact that he ordered his son Thor to enact a genocide against the Jotun, leaving the realm a haunted beauty bereft of its people. Despite the fact that many of the Jotun managed to hide themselves, many more perished, as we learned with some of those more personal examples we went through. And for being the instigator of the genocide of an entire people, Odin rightfully deserves to be seen as a monster whose merciless cruelty knows no bounds. Midgard, though not so much touched by the Aesir in the way Vanaheim or Svartalfheim was, has suffered in many different ways due to Odin's influence. The desolation, which is the result of all Odin's efforts to keep his hold on power and control his fate, has arguably affected Midgard the most. Hellwalkers and all sorts of horrific monsters stalk the eerily quiet lands of Midgard, with nary a village or town thriving as they once might have before Odin's creatures came to this realm. Not only that, but any hopes that Midgard had of becoming the hub of all the 9 realms, due to the influence of Tyr and his groundbreaking temple, were shattered by Odin's machinations, as we can tell by the following codex entry. Midgard was a dream of what could be, if we shared and collaborated. Jotnar, Aesir, Vanir, Elf, Dwarf, and mortals most of all. It was beautiful, but not everyone is capable of sharing. Some believe anything controlled is savage and threatening. and so we were mocked, and tricked, and used, and then slaughtered. Odin and his tribe were barred from our realm, but it was not enough. The wrath of Thor and his terrible hammer have thinned our number in Midgard to the brink of ruin. There is no option but to withdraw, while yet any live to do so. Though Midgard knew much tragedy as a result of Odin's actions, sadly, the Midgardians still for the most part clung to the belief that Odin was their divine father, whose word they need heed. And so once it came time for the prelude to Ragnarok, Odin convinced the Midgardians that to avoid an untimely death during the ensuing war, they must find sanctuary in Asgard, though not really in Asgard itself, but outside its walls, where they were slated to become cannon fodder for Odin's enemies, so he might preserve the lives of his most important forces in the war. Another harrowing example of just how far Odin is willing to go to protect himself and his ambitions. Aside from the realms themselves and the people who live in them, Odin also had a great hand in corrupting many of the various creatures found throughout, and even in warping the dead to suit his aims. Take these codex entries on the dragons, wyverns, and Einherjar as examples. Dragons. These magnificent winged beasts come from Svartalfheim originally, but no, not because they're all transformed dwarves. The curses upon Fafnir and his brothers had to be inspired by something, didn't they? Dwarven history is replete with the lore of great dragons who hoarded gold and holed up in mountainsides, but that's now a bygone age. One of the things Odin did by way of gaining the trust of the dwarves was to help them with their dragon problem. Through a mixture of organized murder, magical imprisonment, and involuntary relocation of their eggs, the dragon presence was effectively Aesir repressed for generations. Of course, Odin was playing a much larger game. Where did all of those stolen eggs end up? That's an answer we may be only just beginning to understand. Wyvern. As majestic as it is dangerous. Unlike drakes and draki, the wyvern is not a member of the dragon family. Their lack of forelegs is more than made up for with the dexterity and speed of their wings. Seeing one take flight makes the feat seem as easy as a fish gliding through the waters of a calm lake. Wyverns were originally tamed, or rather, tamed, at one point in time, by the Vanir. Before the occupation of Vanaheim, riders developed close bonds with their mounts, which required a significant amount of trust from either party. It was well worth the trouble, I've been told. So much so that Odin's Einherjar have opted to replicate it, enslaving the wyverns of Vanaheim in the process. Einherjar, Asgard's finest. A warrior of Midgard wants nothing more than to fall in battle. It would ensure passage to Valhalla, a promised land where the honorable and wretched alike are sent. There, Odin selected the best and gave them another chance to die for him, thus creating the Einherjar. It's diabolically genius, if one would like to view it that way. Instill enough devotion within a bloodthirsty group of undead killers, and you guarantee yourself a near endless supply of fodder for your war. The Valkyries also suffered greatly at Odin's hands, as most of their rank were either corrupted or destroyed once Freya, who was their queen, had been cursed by Odin, with their noble purpose in guiding the dead to Valhalla being warped into that of becoming the wardens of a re-education camp that aimed to mold the Einherjar into the perfect unkillable warriors, who would fight to the death and then some to protect Odin and all he had created. Similarly, the Travelers, who were Midgardian warriors that had been convinced to seek out Jotunheim for riches and glory, also became slaves to Odin's will, as the breadcrumbs he left for them to follow saw them dedicating their lives to the Allfather's vision, for the lie that doing so would afford them with wealth and prosperity that they could scarcely imagine. Now these are roughly the broader aspects of Odin's crimes, all of which were committed to further his goal of subverting his fate, and while much of what we've discussed already didn't actually occur in the story we play through, they all contribute to the state of the world during it, and the actions Odin takes here as well. I'm not going to recant every little thing Odin does in the games to you, as most of you are likely familiar with the general outline of this story. However, I will comment on a few things that are very important when attempting to understand Odin's character. First and foremost is his disguising of himself as Tyr and the way he subtly manipulated Kratos and friends into delaying their conflict with him. As Tyr, Odin posed as a peaceable god who had had enough of war and who only wanted to find a bloodless solution to the situation at hand. His various musings on the horrors of war are quite ironic when you consider all the violence he's instigated over the course of his long existence. And while it might seem appropriate to label him a hypocrite because of this, it's more so accurate to state that Odin, who doesn't necessarily want to fight anyone if he can achieve his goals in other ways, was only offering these rather heartwarming philosophical musings to potentially steer his foes away from the conflict they wished to begin with him. Outside of his mimicry of Tyr, Odin's manipulation of Atreus is perhaps the best example of his skills in the field. Odin treated Atreus with a tenderness one might expect a grandfather to, and in giving him imagined agency in his quest to aid Odin discover the secrets of the mask, at various points, Atreus is successfully lulled into believing Odin might not be as bad as he seems, confusing the boy as he simultaneously attempts to learn all he can from him, while wondering if his enemy is truly the enemy everyone claims he is. His success in this regard almost sees him getting what he wants with Atreus' help. as once the moment finally arrives for Atreus to decide whether or not to don the mask and learn its secrets, there's a clear moment of hesitation on his part that shows just how pervasive Odin's poisonous words can be, as even after witnessing the murders of Brock and Thor, Atreus still doubted, even for a moment, whether or not it was foolhardy to betray Odin or not. Something that should be noted as well is that even though Odin attempted to broker a peace with Kratos when Atreus was under his care, his mask of amiability towards him was quickly cast aside when Kratos refused, and Odin began taking small jabs at him by saying, "That boy of ours," in reference to Atreus, a slip of the tongue meant to rile up Kratos and send him into a frenzy, which seemed to have only been done for the sake of pettiness. Also, as we've already touched on several times, Odin's designs for the defense of Asgard during Ragnarok were utterly reprehensible and should be seen as what they are: a deliberate ordering of innocent, and some not-so-innocent people, to lay down their lives to the last, not to protect their families and their homes, but to protect Odin, something that serves as one of the greater examples of just how rotten to the core Odin truly is. Now, as most of you will be aware, Odin ultimately meets his end during his final climactic battle with Kratos, Freya, and Atreus, fittingly being granted his ultimate demise at the hands of Sindri. And at this end, when we take into account all we've learned of Odin, we have much to discuss in regard to his evil, and how easy it would have been for all he had done to never occur in the first place. To start, Odin is without a doubt a supremely evil bastard, and there is no world where he would ever not be seen as a villain. Responsible for countless murders personally as well as ordered, Odin warped almost all of the 9 realms to suit his purpose, and in the process, we find that he is directly responsible for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths, as well as the near-permanent destruction of many of the ecosystems of the realms he influenced. Not even his own family and people were safe from his designs, as each and every one of them were bent toward service to their lordly Allfather, who would sooner send them to their deaths for a small scrap of knowledge than he would care for them in even the most minuscule of ways. Cruel beyond imagining, merciless, megalomaniacal, and unrelenting, Odin's quest for knowledge beyond the veil of existence steered him away from being a benevolent god of any sort, and right onto the path to becoming a diabolical villain of immense cunning, who earned the title of being the most dire blight ever to fall upon these lands. But as I said a moment ago, it did not have to be this way. Odin, after his slaying of Ymir, which despite being a brutal origin story for this world, was still capable of being a god who truly cared about and protected his new kingdoms. We know that he was capable of loving others, and was also capable of doing much good in the world, but it was that damnable tear, that reality-warping sliver, that so poisoned his mind that he was willing to obliterate everything to learn its secrets. However, it's Odin's possessive and covetous nature that caused him to pursue the path he did, not the tear itself. Odin didn't just want to learn the secrets of the tear, he wanted to be the only person who ever learned its secrets. Odin, the man who calls himself Allfather, was never one to share power, and so it was with the knowledge he hoarded. Because he felt it necessary to keep the tear's secrets to himself, that drove him to commit any atrocity he deemed necessary to discover them on his own. Even Atreus, who played the greatest part in aiding the final steps of his plans, would have likely met his untimely end at Odin's hands once he'd opened the way for him. As a result of his selfish actions in regards to the tear, the prophecy of Ragnarok became an inevitability. But again, it didn't have to be. When Kratos visited the Norns, the fates of the 9 realms, they told him that they have no true prescience. Rather, the actions of gods and men are so predictable that they seem prescient. With that in mind, fate doesn't truly exist in the God of War universe, as Kratos and friends clearly showed when they managed to subvert their fates many times. And if that's the case for them, then that's the case for Odin as well. Ragnarok wasn't something that was just going to happen no matter what. Rather, it was what could happen if Odin continued to follow the path he took. And being a man who believes himself to be the lord of all there is, and decider of reality, there was no way that he was ever going to realize that truth. So with every step he took to try and prevent Ragnarok, he only further assured that it would occur. As Ragnarok was not the ultimate fate of the 9 realms, but the culmination of every dark decision that Odin had ever made, and forced many, many other people to make. In that way, Odin is ultimately the architect of his own torment, and his demise, with all the atrocities he committed in service to his own ambitions being the fuel for his funeral pyre. Had Odin taken a moment to try and understand that knowledge is not something that need belong solely to one person, and that it's something to be shared for the betterment of all, especially when everyone in the realms were under his care, none of the horrors that occurred under his reign would have occurred, and Odin himself, who was immortal, would have likely never died and enjoyed a fruitful and peaceful existence as the lord of all that he had created. But sometimes it's true that we cannot escape our natures, or rather, we are unwilling to escape them. And because he was who he was, it was in all likelihood impossible for Odin to take any other path than the one he took. Maybe Odin thought the ends justified the means, because he believed that once he had finally discovered all the Tear's secrets, he would be able to bring back everyone and everything he had sacrificed for his cause, retroactively righting all his wrongs, reforging his world into one where no one would be burdened by the unknown, and where harmony and peace would flourish under an all-knowing and all-seeing God. Even if that was the case, none of these things were ever guarantees, just the mad assumptions of a man who would abuse everyone and everything in existence to ensure he obtained what he desired most. For succumbing to such mind-boggling madness, we can find sympathy for Odin, a man who could not overcome his faults to see that he was the engineer of all the misery that occurred during his reign, as well as the man who was steadily creating his own end. But in the face of all he unleashed upon the Nine Realms, it's hard to find sympathy for him, for Odin has without a doubt cemented himself as one of the greatest villains in video game history, and a dread example of what evil can be wrought by a mind so singularly obsessed with the self. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Odin? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.